Hi everyone. Right, what I'm going to do with you in this video today is talk to you a little bit about a historical debate that kind of plays into what you started to look at with Hitler's leadership during the 1930s. Okay, historical debate and historical arguments are really important for your coursework. There is 10 marks available in your coursework for your use of historians, so you do need to be aware of what some of the key arguments and debates are that historians have thrashed out over the years. So we're going to look at one today which very much, like I say, links into some of the things that you should have started to look at over the last few lessons with Hitler's power in the 1930s. And that debate is this one here. So, to what extent was Hitler a weak dictator? Okay, now I'm going to run through with you two sides of the argument, two positions. So we've got the side of the argument that says no, he was not a weak dictator, he was actually a strong dictator. And those historians are known as the intentionalists. And then we are going to look at the supportive side of the argument, that yes, he was a weak dictator. Those historians are known as the structuralists. Now, there is a little bit of information about these sort of schools of historical thought in the course guidebook that Abby has made for you for the 1930s. But I just wanted to kind of talk through this in a bit more detail with you all. Okay, so I'm going to start with the intentionalist side of the argument. So the intentionalist debate, or the intentionalist argument, is essentially that Hitler was a strong dictator and that he should be seen as the master of the Nazi state. So his will is what happens in Germany. It all comes back to him and the decision making and the kind of authority over the government that he himself possesses. So, what might historians on this side of the argument, what examples might they use to back up this assertion that he is a strong dictator? So, one of the things that they will talk to, and there's a great deal of evidence to support, comes in the area of foreign policy. Okay, so if you think to our Britain module that we did at the beginning of last year, we talked about appeasement. And we had loads of examples of Hitler and Germany doing things that contravened the Treaty of Versailles. So whether it was the Anschluss with Austria, or the remilitarisation of the Rhineland, or the decision to rearm again, all of these things contravened the Versailles Treaty. He wasn't supposed to do. He did it, and he got away with it. So that kind of builds this argument that he's bold, he's taking these really risky decisions and actions, but they're paying off. So he's a strong leader in that respect. We could also trace this through to the beginning of the Second World War as well. The first couple of years in the Second World War, the Nazi state, the army, are extremely successful. If you look at a map of Europe for 1941, what you'll find is that Germany have invaded a significant proportion of Europe at that point in time. So again, feeds into this idea that in terms of foreign policy, he is extremely successful. Another argument that could add some weight to that is by the late 1930s, by about 1937, Hitler has taken direct command of the German army as well. So it is his policy agenda that his generals are then going away and fulfilling. Okay. Right, second argument that we might find these historians refer to is in relation not just to the country, but to the Nazi party. And they would argue that even before Hitler comes to power in Germany as Chancellor in 1933, what he's managed to do in the 1920s is assume complete personal authority over the Nazi party as well. And certainly we see that when Hitler comes out of prison in 1925, that he reasserts control over the party very, very quickly, gets them all on board with his particular vision for what should happen next, i.e. contest elections. That's kind of his new strategy. And he embeds something that historians have labelled the Führerprinzip, the leadership principle. and that is very much this idea of that one strong leader and kind of an authoritarian style of rule for party and country is the right way to go. And he does largely, apart from one or two disgruntled voices, he does largely dominate the party from that point onwards. Okay. Another argument that we've got here is how important Hitler is personally to the Nazi Party's rise to power in government as well. So last week we spent quite a lot of time looking at how the Nazis came to power, and one of the key factors that we looked at was Hitler. He was charismatic, he was this great public speaker, he developed immense popularity, you could argue, with large sections of the German population, and also he demonstrated political shrewdness in that he was able to manipulate a lot of the key political figures to get that position of Chancellor. So I'm thinking of people like von Papen. Von Papen kind of pleaded by January 1933 with Hindenburg to make Hitler Chancellor, and he did that because Hitler had manipulated him into believing that he could be controlled. So he showed really good political skill there as well, and strength as a leader. Final point here links to what you were looking at last week as well with the consolidation of power. So if you think of the key events that you looked at last week that make up Hitler's path to strengthening his position, so he's not just Chancellor, but he's emerging the position of President with the position of Chancellor, he makes some quite bold choices. You know, the Reichstag fire incident, the Night of the Long Knives, all of the Enabling Act, all of these things were quite bold, risky decisions that he made and were successfully fulfilled and allowed him to strengthen his position. Again, that shows a strength of leadership, the intentionalist historians would argue. Okay, right, I'm going to turn this round just 1 second, and then we're going to look at the structuralist debate. Okay, right, so structuralist historians. So what they are going to argue is that he might show signs of strength at times, but there are still a number of constraints and limits to Hitler's power. Some of those things are just about the structure of the state, you know, that there are things there that limit his power. But some of these limitations are about Hitler personally as well. So he has weaknesses. So I'm going to kind of decipher this, or separate this out rather, to two separate areas of weakness that we could look at. So we're going to talk about decision making, and then we're going to look at kind of wider issues that Hitler sort of gives into as well. So if we start with decision making first of all, what structuralist historians might talk about is Hitler's work habits, his patterns of work, and they will point to this idea that Hitler is actually quite a lazy leader in some respects. Okay, we've got there's loads of primary source evidence of people who worked with Hitler day to day that demonstrate that he's not a workaholic, Hitler. Okay, so he's not like somebody like Margaret Thatcher, for example, who famously kind of survived as Prime Minister on kind of 3-4 hours sleep a night. That's definitely not Hitler. Okay, he's quite lazy in his work habits. And something that feeds into that is that from about sort of 1937, 1938-ish, Hitler kind of retreats from the capital a little bit. He doesn't really spend that much time in Berlin, in the structures of government there. Instead, he increasingly spends time at his kind of mountain retreat in a little town, the Berchtesgaden in the Alps. And what that means is that he's a little bit distant, he's a bit removed, and if people want to speak to Hitler, or if he wants to speak to them, they have to come and visit him in this mountain retreat location. So he's not there day to day. So that could imply that, does he really fully have a grip on what's happening day to day? Okay, third argument around decision making is that because we've just said Hitler does retreat a little bit, what that does is it creates a lot of internal competition amongst the leaders below Hitler. So some of the key leaders within the Nazi state, people like Himmler, Goebbels, Goering, some of these kind of key individuals, they actually end up having quite a lot of personal power themselves because Hitler has taken a little bit of a step back. And they're not always working in line with each other. There's quite a lot of infighting amongst these figures. And structuralist historians would argue that what that does is that actually creates a lot of chaos in government. Government could be run better, but Hitler has almost created this situation where things are quite chaotic. And building into that, there is another little historical interpretation that I'm going to just really briefly introduce you to now. We're going to talk a lot more about this when we start to look at the Holocaust. And that is this idea or this principle known as working towards the Führer. So what that means is that Hitler sets the broad ideological vision of what he wants to happen, and these individual leaders in their own way are interpreting what they think that means in terms of policy. So Hitler's not getting involved in the minutiae of policy. He set the broad theme, this is what I want to happen, you go away and deliver it. So this feeds into this idea that he could argue he's seen as a weak dictator because it does create a bit of chaos. He doesn't really know what's going on at a granular, low level. They could be doing anything, and he might not be fully aware of it. However, he could flip that back to sign that he's a strong dictator, because what he's done is he's set up a system where these people are delivering his overall ideological vision. They are doing that. So he doesn't have to get involved in the minutiae detail. So that's another theory that we're going to talk a little bit more about when we do the Holocaust, working towards the Führer. Okay, other things that structuralist historians might look towards, kind of issues where Hitler has to give in slightly. So they might talk a bit about the economy. One of Hitler's big ideological opinions was that women should be in the home, having children and looking after those children and their husbands. So initially, Hitler had kind of withdrawn female employment. Women in the early 1930s didn't really have much job opportunities. That was deliberately removed from them so they could go and get married and have children. However, as the 1930s progresses, what we start to see is female employment creep back up because the economy needs the additional labour. So that is kind of a sign of the reality. He hasn't been able to create the circumstance in reality where the economy doesn't need female employment. So that could be an issue you look at. There are a number of occasions, particularly in the early 1930s, where Hitler also can be seen to be giving into pressure from the wider party. Okay, so I've given you an example of the Jewish boycott on shops and businesses in 1933. So this is a really early example. But Hitler kind of came under a lot of pressure after he became Chancellor in 1933 from members of the SA, for example, to suddenly push out a really strongly anti-Semitic policy agenda. He didn't feel like his power was secure enough to do that, so he had to be seen to give them a little bit of anti-Semitism that would keep them satisfied, but nothing too extreme that would cause a reaction, say, from Hindenburg, who was still president in 1933. So what he did was he allowed this one-day boycott of Jewish shops and businesses. He didn't really want to do it, but he felt he had to do something to give in to the more radical elements of the Nazi party. So that's him giving in, you could argue. And then the final point that I've got here is around opposition. In general, there's not a huge amount of overt, dangerous opposition that Hitler and the Nazis face internally in Germany, but there are a couple of examples that you could look to where opposition does seem to worry Hitler and he gives in on something. And I've given you the example of the church and the policy of euthanasia. Okay, so 1939, we see this kind of policy of euthanasia of children with disabilities in particular really ramping up. And the German public are aware of this policy. It kind of leaks out that this is what's happening when these children are going off to homes that are supposed to be caring for them, but actually what's happening to them is that they are being killed. And the church, leaders of the church, start to speak out against this policy. So this is a really good example of some actual legitimate opposition towards Nazi policy, and Hitler just stops it, ends the policy in the face of that opposition. So that's another example of him giving in, you could argue. Okay, so intentionalist historians, structuralist historians, those are some of the key issues that they would refer to in relation to, is Hitler a weak dictator or not? There is no definitive answer. This could be a good coursework question if people want to explore this a little bit more and develop your own arguments on this. We're going to refer back to these two schools of thought, intentionalist and structuralist, when we look at the Holocaust again. So we're going to kind of circle back to this as well. Okay? Alright, bye for now.